You only get $10, Mom. The rest is ours. My son Ryan smiled when he said that. He smiled at me in the lawyer's office, sitting across that dark mahogany table, his hands clasped like a businessman who was already counting his fortune. The $15 million that my ex-husband Robert left when he died. $15 million that he believed were his. Jessica, my daughter-in-law, let out a high-pitched laugh, a sharp metallic laugh that bounced off the shelves packed with legal books and binders. She leaned toward me with those eyes shining with triumph and whispered just loud enough for everyone to hear. You're finally going to learn your place, Alina. I remained silent, still in my rigid-backed chair, wearing my pale gray dress that had more years on it than dignity, my wrinkled hands resting on my lap like two tired birds. I said nothing. I just looked at the lawyer, Mr. Hayes, a man in his 60s with silver-rimmed glasses and a thick folder in front of him. I waited silently for him to read the next page. Actually, Mr. Hayes began, clearing his throat, his fingers pausing on the paper. Your mother. I watched Ryan's face change. How the smile froze first, then cracked. How his lips parted without finding words. How he turned pale second by second, as if the blood was leaving his body, looking for a cleaner place to be. Jessica stopped laughing. The silence that fell then was dense, heavy, the kind that crushes your chest and makes the air hard to breathe. But what they didn't know, what neither of them imagined as they looked at me as if I were a beggar invited by mistake to a king's banquet, is that I hadn't been called to that office to lose. I had been called to witness the fall of those who believed that forgetting came without a price. 3 weeks earlier, when I received the call from the law firm, I was in the kitchen of my one-bedroom apartment in an older part of the city, a small place that smelled like stale coffee and the pies I sold on Sundays just to keep the lights on. The phone rang while I was drying my hands on a worn-out dish rag. And at first I thought it was the bank again, reminding me that my small pension check was late. But the voice on the other end was formal, polite, and it pronounced a name I hadn't heard in 20 years. Mrs. Alina Griffin. I am Arthur Hayes. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Robert Griffin. I regret to inform you that he has passed away. Your presence is required for the reading of the will. Robert, the man I married when I was 22 and the world seemed like a generous place. The man who became a millionaire while I became a ghost. The man who signed the divorce papers without looking me in the eye. 30 years ago when Ryan was barely 12. My presence, I repeated, feeling the words get stuck in my throat. What for? It's a requirement of the will, ma'am. All beneficiaries must be present. Beneficiaries? The words sounded like a cruel joke. I wasn't the beneficiary of anything. I had stopped being one the day Robert handed me a check for $5,000 and told me that was all I would receive. So you can start over, he said. Then, as if 30 years of marriage could fit in a manila envelope, but I accepted the appointment. Because after living 65 years and learning that life owes you no explanations, I also learned that sometimes the answers arrive when you no longer expect them. The day of the will reading dawned gray with that kind of low sky that seems to press down on the buildings. I dressed in the best I had, that gray dress I bought at a thrift store, some black shoes with worn-down heels, and an ivory-gold scarf that had been my mother's. I took 2 buses to get downtown, where the law offices occupied buildings of glass and steel that reflected a world I didn't belong to. I went up to the 14th floor in an elevator that smelled like expensive perfume and ambition. And when the doors opened, there was Ryan, my son. He didn't hug me. He didn't ask how I had gotten there, if I needed anything, if I was okay. He looked me up and down, sizing me up like a stain on the carpet, and said, "You're late." "I arrived at the scheduled time," I replied. Jessica appeared behind him, wrapped in a wine-colored pants suit and heels that clicked like hammers against the marble. She looked at me with that mix of pity and contempt that only successful daughters-in-law know how to perfect. "What a lovely dress, Eleanor," she said, dragging out the words. "Vintage, right?" I didn't answer. I had learned long ago that some words are only looking for blood, and I had no more to give. We entered Mr. Hayes's office together. A large room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, shelves full of books that no one read, and that enormous mahogany table where destinies are decided and fortunes are divided. Ryan and Jessica sat on the winner's side of the table. I sat alone across from them like a defendant awaiting sentencing. Mr. Hayes opened the folder, cleared his throat, and began to read in that monotonous voice lawyers use when emotions get in the way. I, Robert Griffin, being of sound mind, declare as my last will and testament. Rayan couldn't stop smiling. Jessica drummed her nails against the table, impatient to hear the figure that would change her life. And I just breathed because I knew something they didn't. That silence is not weakness. It is the sound of a truth waiting for its turn to speak. Mr. Hayes's office was the kind of place where money spoke quietly, but everyone listened. Cream-colored walls, abstract paintings that meant nothing but cost a fortune, and that heavy silence that only exists in spaces where it's decided who matters and who doesn't. I didn't matter. At least that's what my son's eyes had been telling me since I walked in. I settled into the chair, feeling the worn fabric of my gray dress brush against the fine leather of the seat. My shoes, with soles almost smooth from so much walking, barely touched the Persian rug that probably cost more than everything I owned. Rayan tapped his fingers on the table. He wore a Swiss watch that gleamed under the ceiling lights, a suit that smelled new and ambitious. His hair, slicked back with gel, made him look older than his 43 years. Or maybe it was the hardness in his gaze that aged him, that coldness I didn't remember seeing when he was a child, when he would climb onto my lap and ask me to tell him stories before bed. When did I lose that boy? Jessica leaned toward him and whispered something in his ear. He nodded without looking at her, his eyes fixed on Mr. Hayes, who continued reading the will with a deliberation of someone who has seen too many families destroyed by legal documents. I declare that my assets valued at $15 million will be distributed as follows. My heart beat slowly, so slowly that I felt each thump like a distant drum. I expected nothing. Robert had made that clear to me 30 years ago when he handed me that check and closed the door on our shared life. $5,000. That was it. The price of 3 decades of marriage, of sleepless nights caring for a sick child, of meals prepared with love, of a youth given to a man who built his empire while I held up the invisible foundations. But here I was, summoned, and that for some reason made me feel a strange tingling in my chest. Like when you know something is about to change, but you don't know if it will be for the better or for the worse. To Mr. Rayan Griffin, my only son, Mr. Hayes continued. Rayan sat up straighter. Jessica squeezed his hand. He is bequested. The silence became solid. I could touch it, weigh it, feel it crushing the air between us. $10. For a second, nobody moved. The words floated in the air like something unreal, as if Mr. Hayes had spoken in a language none of us understood. Rayan blinked once, twice. "Excuse me," he said, his voice strangled. Mr. Hayes repeated without looking up from the document. $10 to his wife, Mrs. Jessica Griffin. He likewise bequeaths $10. Jessica let out a laugh, but it wasn't a laugh of joy. It was one of disbelief, the kind of laugh that sounds like breaking glass. "This is a mistake," Rayan said, jumping to his feet. The chair scraped backward. "It has to be a mistake. My father he wouldn't do this." Mr. Hayes looked at him over his silver-rimmed glasses. "There is no mistake, Mr. Griffin. The will was drafted 6 months ago while your father was in full mental possession of his faculties with 3 witnesses present and certified by a notary public. Then it's void contested. It can't be valid. It is completely valid." Rayan was breathing heavily as if the air had become thicker. He ran his hands through his hair, messing up the gel, leaving stray strands that made him look more human, more vulnerable. Jessica stood up too, her eyes blazing, and the rest, the 15 million. Who does it go to? I remained still. So still I could have been mistaken for one of those statues in the museums I visited once back when I still had money for such things. Mr. Hayes took a deep breath. He turned another page and he said something I didn't understand at first because my brain refused to process the words. To Mrs. Alina Vance Griffin, he bequeaths the entirety of the $15 million. The world stopped. It wasn't dramatic. There was no background music or dimming lights, just a silence so absolute I could hear the hum of the fluorescent light in the ceiling, the tick of the wall clock, my own breath entering and leaving my lungs as if it had just remembered how. "What?" I whispered. Rayan spun toward me. His face had lost all its color. He looked like a man on the edge of a cliff, discovering the ground beneath his feet was never solid. "No," he said. "Just that, no." Jessica took a step toward the table, her hands spread like claws. "This is insane. She has no right. She divorced him 30 years ago. She has no right at all. Mr. Hayes ignored her. He looked directly at me, and for the first time since I entered that office, I saw something like warmth in his gray eyes. Mrs. Griffin, your ex-husband left very specific instructions. He wishes for me to continue reading. I nodded because even though my mind was a whirlwind of confusion, even though I felt like I was dreaming and would wake up any moment in my little apartment smelling of coffee, I needed to hear. I needed to understand. Mr. Hayes took another document from the folder. This one was different. It didn't have the rigid format of a legal will. It was a letter handwritten in Robert's shaky but recognizable script. Mr. Griffin left this to be read in the presence of all parties. It says to whom it may concern, especially my son, Rayan. If you are hearing this, it means you already know my decision, and I know you don't understand it. Allow me to explain. Rayan sank back into his chair. Jessica remained standing, petrified, her lips parted. And I felt something inside me, something that had been dormant for decades, begin to wake up. Mr. Hayes continued reading. Alanner deserves every cent of that 15 million. Not out of pity, not for nostalgia, but because those 15 million exist thanks to her. Tears began to cloud my eyes without permission. I blinked, trying to keep them in, but it was useless. They had waited 30 years to come out. What my son doesn't know, what nobody knows, is that when I was a broken man with an idea and $0 in the bank, it was Alina who sold her grandmother's jewelry to give me the seed money. It was $6,000. She never asked me to repay it. She never reminded me of it. She just said, I believe in you. Rayan was shaking his head, but his eyes were fixed on the letter as if hypnotized. When the business almost went under in the second year, it was Alina who worked 3 shifts as a secretary to pay the office rent. I didn't even ask her to. She just did it. And when I asked her why, she told me because this family is not going to sink. Mr. Hayes paused. He took off his glasses. He cleaned them with a handkerchief from his pocket. He put them back on and continued. I built an empire, but I didn't lay the foundations. She did. And when success came, when the money started to flow and opportunities multiplied, I forgot. I forgot who had been there when there was nothing. I fell in love with another woman. I asked for a divorce. And Alina, the woman who had given everything, left in silence. I closed my eyes. The memories flooded back. Robert telling me he had met someone younger, someone who understood his ambitions. Me packing my things while Rayan cried in his room. The signing of the papers, the check, the door closing. The silence after Mr. Hayes folded the letter carefully as if it were sacred and placed it on the table. The silence in the office was so deep I could hear my own ragged breathing, the dull beat of my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird that has just seen the door open. Rayan was staring at some point on the wall. His hands, the hands I had held when he was learning to walk, were trembling slightly on the polished surface of the table. Jessica had collapsed into her chair, her face a mask of disbelief, like an actress who forgets her lines in the middle of the most important scene. There's more, Mr. Hayes said, his voice almost compassionate. He picked up another page. This one looked more recent, typed on a computer but with a handwritten signature at the end. Robert's signature. That broad, confident signature I remembered from so many documents, so many contracts, from those divorce papers I signed with a trembling hand 30 years ago. I know my son will wonder why I did this, Mr. Hayes read. Let me answer you, Rayan, from the only place where I can now speak the truth. For years, I educated you in success, in ambition, in conquest. I taught you to see the world as a territory to be dominated, as an equation where only numbers and results matter. I gave you everything material you needed, but I forgot to teach you the most important thing, gratitude. Rayan closed his eyes. A single tear slid down his cheek, bright and lonely as a falling star. 6 months ago, when the doctors told me my heart was failing, I started reviewing old documents, papers stored in boxes I hadn't opened in decades. And I found something that broke my heart. The receipts for the jewelry Alina sold to finance me. The bank letters where she appeared as a co-signer on my first loans. The employment contracts showing her working 3 jobs simultaneously while I built my company. I looked at my hands, those wrinkled hands that had scrubbed floors, that had typed for endless hours, that had prepared thousands of meals, that had worked until they bled so a man could chase his dreams. I never asked for recognition. I never expected anything in return because that's how I loved back then, without receipts, without invoices, without contracts guaranteeing a return. I just loved and I gave and I trusted that it was enough. I called Eleanor. Mr. Hayes continued reading. It was the hardest call of my life. I asked her why she had never reminded me, why she never demanded what was hers, why she accepted that miserable check and disappeared in silence. Do you know what she told me, Rayan? She said, because I didn't want you to feel your father was a man who owed favors. I wanted you to grow up admiring him. Even if it meant I disappeared from the picture, I felt something break inside me. It wasn't pain. It was something deeper. It was the sound of all the walls I had built around my heart beginning to crumble. 30 years of silence, of swallowed pride, of dignity maintained at the cost of my own truth, disintegrated with every word Mr. Hayes read. Rayan sobbed, a dry, masculine sob, the kind that sounds like defeat. Jessica glared at him. "Get a grip," she hissed under her breath. "We can still fight this. No judge is going to." "Shut up," Rayan said. His voice was broken but firm. "Please just shut up." Mr. Hayes cleared his throat and continued. "My son, I gave you everything except the right example. I taught you to win but not to be grateful. I showed you the path to success, but I forgot to teach you the value of others' sacrifice. This 15 million is not a fortune I built alone. It is the fruit of a seed that your mother planted with her own hands, with her own sweat, with her own blood." The lawyer paused. He took a sip of water from a glass on the table. The liquid went down his throat with a sound that was audible in the thick silence of the room. "Therefore, I have decided that everything should return to her, not as compensation, because no amount of money can compensate for 30 years of being forgotten, but as recognition, as justice, as the only way I have from wherever I am now to say, I saw you. I finally saw you. And I understood that without you, none of this would have existed. I brought my hands to my face." The tears were falling freely now, warm and salty, washing away decades of silence. They weren't tears of joy or even sadness. They were tears of liberation, of a truth that could finally breathe, that could finally exist outside of my chest where I had guarded it like a dangerous secret. Rayan stood up. He walked to the window, turning his back to me. His shoulders rose and fell with each labored breath. I could see his reflection in the glass. A broken man, a son who had just understood the price his mother paid for his comfort. Jessica also stood, but her reaction was different. She grabbed her designer handbag, one of those that cost more than my apartment's rent, and clutched it to her chest like a shield. "This isn't going to stand," she said, her voice laced with venom. "We're taking this to court. We're going to prove that this will was made under duress, under manipulation. Under what?" I interrupted. It was the first time I had spoken since Mr. Hayes started reading. My voice sounded strange, stronger than I expected, firmer. Jessica looked at me as if she had just remembered I was there. "Under what will you prove it's invalid?" I repeated, standing up slowly. My knees creaked. My back protested. But I held myself straight with all the dignity that 65 years of a humble life had taught me to cultivate. "Under the truth," Jessica spat. "Under the fact that you manipulated a dying man into changing his will. Under the fact that you appeared out of nowhere after 30 years to I didn't appear out of nowhere," I said calmly. "He called me. And when he did, I went because that's how I've always been. When someone I loved needed me, I was there. Even if that someone had erased me from his life, even if he had forgotten me, even if he had replaced me," Mr. Hayes intervened. "Mrs. Griffin, the will was drafted 6 months ago when Mr. Robert Griffin was still in acceptable health. It was reviewed by 3 specialists in estate law. There are video recordings of the declaration of his wishes. There are medical certificates confirming his mental lucidity, and there are witnesses who have no connection to Mrs. Eleanor Griffin. If you wish to contest it, you are within your rights, but I am advising you that you will not be successful." Jessica was breathing heavily in a fury. Her eyes darted from me to Rayan, from Rayan to the lawyer, looking for a crack, an escape, a way to reverse the irreversible. "You planned this," she said, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You knew he was sick. You sought him out. You convinced him. You played the poor victim card. Enough." Rayan's voice cut through the air like a knife. He turned from the window, his face red, swollen, devastated. "Enough, Jessica. Stop. Stop. Are you telling me you accept this? That you accept this woman getting everything while this woman," Rayan said, his voice breaking, "is my mother?" The silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the silence of waiting. It was the silence of understanding of the truth settling like dust after a storm. Mr. Hayes closed the folder. "There is one final clause," he said, looking at me. "Mr. Griffin specified that the $10 designated for his son and daughter-in-law have a condition." Rayan looked at him with bloodshot eyes. "What condition?" "That if within a period of 5 years they demonstrate dignity, genuine repentance, and a verifiable change of character. Mrs. Griffin will have the option, not the obligation, to share part of the inheritance with you. The decision will be entirely hers." Rayan stood motionless. The lawyer's words floated in the air like ash after a fire, covering everything, changing the color of reality. 5 years, dignity, repentance. Words that sounded simple but weighed like stones on his hunched back. Jessica let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "How convenient. How perfect. So you get to keep us waiting. Is that it? Make us dance like puppets for 5 years while you enjoy millions that don't belong to you." I looked at her, really looked at her, not with anger, not with contempt, with something more like pity. Because I recognized something in her eyes that I had seen before in the mirror many years ago. Fear, that visceral terror of losing the ground beneath your feet, of discovering that everything you thought was solid was just smoke. "I didn't write that will," I said in a quiet voice. "I didn't ask for any of this. But you're accepting it, aren't you?" Jessica spat. "You're going to take that money and leave us with $10. $10 miserable dollars. As if we're beggars. As if your son, the son you gave birth to, isn't worth more than that." Something twisted in my chest. Because she was right about one thing. Rayan was my son, the child I had carried for 9 months, who I had nursed through sleepless nights, who I had raised with my bare hands when Robert was too busy building empires to notice his family was falling apart. But that child had become this man who had looked at me with disdain when I walked in, this man who had smiled when he told me I would only get $10, this man who hadn't called me in 8 years, who didn't know where I lived, who hadn't invited me to his wedding to Jessica, who had deleted my number from his phone like, delete a mistake. "My son is worth far more than $10, I said, my voice cracking. "He's worth infinitely more. But the man he has chosen to be, that man needs to learn something I couldn't teach him." Rayan turned to me. His eyes were red, wet, filled with something I couldn't tell if it was repentance or just the shame of being exposed. "Mom," he began, but I couldn't hear it. Not yet. Because if I listened, if I let that word mom enter my chest after so many years of not hearing it, I would fall apart and I needed to stay whole. Just a little longer. Mr. Hayes cleared his throat. "Mrs. Griffin, I need you to sign these documents to formalize the transfer of assets. If you like, you can take a few days to review everything with your own lawyer." "I don't have a lawyer," I said. "I can recommend several trustworthy ones." I nodded, though my mind was elsewhere. It was in that small apartment where I had lived for the last 30 years. In that kitchen where I prepared pies on Sundays to sell to the neighbors. In that narrow bed where I spent my nights reading library books because I couldn't afford to buy them. In those thin walls where I heard the families next door laugh, argue, live while I existed in a silence I had learned to call peace. What would I do with $15 million? The question sounded absurd, even in my own mind. Me who counted coins for the bus. Me who saved grocery bags to reuse them. Me who had learned to stretch a pound of rice for 2 weeks. What did I know about millions? "I need some air," I said suddenly. I stood up, feeling my knees protest, my back creaking with that familiar ache that was already a part of me. I walked toward the door with slow, dignified steps, even though every muscle in my body was trembling. "Mrs. Griffin," Mr. Hayes called out. "The documents." "Tomorrow," I replied without turning. "I'll be back tomorrow." I left the office, feeling all eyes fixed on my back. The hallway was long, lined with a wine-led carpet that muffled the sound of my worn shoes. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like trapped insects. The walls were decorated with black and white photographs of the city in different eras, as if time was something that could be framed and hung for all to see. I reached the elevator and pressed the button. The doors opened with a soft, mechanical sound. I stepped in it. It was Rayan. He was running down the hall, his jacket unbuttoned, his tie crooked, his hair a mess. He stuck his hand between the doors before they could close. The sensor detected the obstacle and the doors opened again. He stepped into the elevator with me. He was panting. He smelled of cold sweat and desperation. The doors closed. We were alone in that metal and mirror box, descending toward the real world, away from the offices where destinies are dealt out with paper and signatures. "Mom," he said again. His voice sounded broken. I didn't know. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes fixed on the numbers changing above the door. 14, 13, 12, I didn't know what you did for Dad. I didn't know that you were the one. It doesn't matter. I said yes, it matters. It matters everything. 11, 10, 9, when did you stop calling me? I asked. My voice sounded harsher than I intended. When did you decide I didn't exist anymore? Rayan leaned against the elevator wall. The mirror reflected his shattered face, multiplying it in infinite angles. When Jessica and I got married, he admitted. She said you represented a past I needed to overcome. She said that to grow, I needed to cut ties. And I believed her because it was easier to believe her than to face the truth. What truth? 876, that I was ashamed of you. The words landed like knives, direct, sharp, honest. I turned to him. His eyes were full of tears he wouldn't let himself shed. I was ashamed of your used clothes, he continued, his voice trembling. Of your small apartment, of your job selling pies, of my friends asking why my mother lived like that when my father was a millionaire. It was easier to say you were sick, that you lived far away, that we were estranged. It was easier to erase you than to explain you. 5, 4, 3. And now, I said slowly, you find out that everything your father built, everything you enjoyed, everything that made you feel superior existed because I sold my grandmother's jewelry. Because I worked 3 shifts, because I gave everything and asked for nothing, he nodded. A tear finally escaped, rolling down his cheek. Now you find out, I continued, that the woman you were ashamed of was the only reason you had anything to be proud of. 2-1 ground floor. The doors opened. The building's lobby stretched out before us. Gleaming marble, decorative plants, people in expensive suits walking with purpose and haste. I stepped out of the elevator. Rayan followed me. Mom, please give me a chance to fix this. Give me those 5 years. Give me a chance to be the son I should have always been. I stopped. I turned to him. I really looked at him as I hadn't in years. I saw the boy he had been. The rebellious teenager, the ambitious man, and now the broken man begging for something money couldn't buy. Redemption. It's not up to me, I said softly. Your father gave you 5 years. Use them. Prove you can be more than your shame, more than your ambition, more than the son who learned to forget where he came from. And you, he asked, do you forgive me? That question, that impossible question. How do you forgive someone who erased you from their life? How do you forgive years of silence, of forgotten birthdays, of calls never returned? How do you forgive the shame he felt for you when you never felt anything but pride for him? I don't know, I answered honestly. I don't know yet, Rayan. But I do know this. Forgiveness isn't begged for, it's earned. Day by day, action by action. Time will tell if you've really changed, or if you're just scared of losing what you thought was yours. I walked toward the building's exit, feeling the weight of my entire life on my shoulders. Every step sounded hollow against the polished marble, as if my feet didn't belong in this place of luxury and promises. The revolving door spat me out onto the street where the noise of the city hit me like a wave. Horns, voices, the constant hum of thousands of lives moving in different directions. The sky was still gray. It threatened rain, but couldn't decide to let a single drop fall. I stood on the sidewalk, surrounded by people who passed me without seeing me, just as it had always been. Invisible, transparent. An old woman in a gray dress who caught no one's attention. Except now I wasn't that woman anymore. Now I was the eyes to $15 million. The word sounded false even in my mind. As if I had expected something, as if I had planned this. As if I had lived for 30 years with the secret hope that Robert would remember. But no, I had lived expecting nothing. Because I had learned that expectations only bring disappointment. I searched my old handbag for the coins for the bus. My fingers touched keys, a frayed handkerchief, a thin wallet where I kept my ID, and the $22 that had to last me until the end of the week. Everything I owned fit in that faded cloth bag I had bought at a street market 10 years ago. Everything I owned until today. Ma'am, I turned. It was the building's doorman, a young man with an impeccable uniform and a professional smile. Do you need a taxi? I shook my head. No, thank you. I'll take the bus. He looked at me strangely, probably wondering what a woman like me was doing coming out of a building like that. He didn't know I had just become a millionaire. He didn't know that the woman in front of him no longer needed to count coins for transport, but I was still counting them. I walked 3 blocks to the bus stop. My feet hurt inside the worn-out shoes. A blister had opened on my right heel, and I could feel the skin rubbing against the hard leather with every step. But I kept going because that's how I had always lived, ignoring the pain, pushing forward, surviving. The stop was crowded. A young mother with 2 small children. A man in paint-stained overalls. A teenager with headphones staring at her phone. Real people. People like me. People who knew the exact price of bread. Who calculated if they could afford a coffee or if that money was better saved for the electric bill. I sat on the metal bench. The cold seeped through my thin dress. I closed my eyes and let the city noise wash over me. Horns, laughter, the squeal of brakes, the shout of a street vendor selling fruit, life moving all around me, indifferent to the private revolutions happening in people's hearts. Alina. I opened my eyes. A woman had sat down next to me. It took me a moment to recognize her. Brenda, my neighbor from the apartment below, a woman my age, with hair dyed a brown color that didn't look quite natural and a face marked by the same years of hard work as mine. "Brenda," I said, surprised. "What are you doing over here?" "I just came from a job interview," she replied with a tired smile. "Secretary at an accounting office. I don't think they'll call me, but you have to try, right?" I nodded. Brenda had lost her job 3 months ago. Since then, I'd seen her getting thinner, quieter, with that look of someone who counts every penny and still can't make ends meet. "And you," she asked, "you look different. Did something happen?" I opened my mouth to answer, to say that yes, something monumental had happened, something that would change my life forever. But the words got stuck in my throat, because how do you explain to someone who is struggling to survive that you've just inherited a fortune? How do you share that news without it sounding like an insult to their reality? "I went to a meeting," I said finally. "Legal matters. My ex-husband passed away." "Oh, Alina, I'm so sorry. Don't be. I hadn't seen him in 30 years. Brenda nodded with understanding. She also had her story of divorces, of men who promised and forgot, of lives rebuilt with scraps and hope. The bus arrived with a squeal of brakes. We got on together. I paid my fare with the exact coins. The driver didn't even look at me as I handed him the money. He just mechanically opened the door. A gesture repeated 1,000 times a day with 1,000 different people. I sat next to Brenda on one of the orange plastic seats. The bus smelled of humanity, sweat, cheap perfume, the aroma of fried food someone was carrying in a bag. It smelled like my life, like everything I knew. "You know what I was thinking today?" Brenda said, looking out the window. "That sometimes I wonder if it was worth it. All this effort, all this sacrifice, and for what? To live in tiny apartments, to count coins, to end up old with nothing to show for it." Her words cut through me because I had thought the same thing so many times. In the sleepless nights when the silence of the apartment was so vast, I could hear my own thoughts screaming. Was it worth it? All that work, all that sacrifice for Robert, for Rayan, for a family that forgot me. "It was worth it," I said, and I was surprised by the firmness in my voice. Brenda looked at me curiously. "It was worth it," I repeat, "because we survived. Because we are here breathing, existing despite everything that tried to break us. That's more valuable than any bank account." She smiled, a sad but genuine smile. "You're stronger than me, Alina." "No, I'm just older. And when you live this long, you learn that strength isn't about not falling. It's about getting up every single time you do." The bus moved through the familiar streets of my neighborhood. Old buildings with peeling paint. Corner stores with faded signs. Kids playing soccer in the street. Clothes hanging on rusty balconies. My world. The world I had known for 30 years. But something had changed. I had changed. Not because I had money now, but because I finally knew the truth. Robert had seen it. He had acknowledged my sacrifice. And even though it came 30 years late, even though he had to die to do it, that truth now existed. It was written on legal documents. Read aloud, recorded in the memory of those present. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer forgotten. I was seen. Finally, after decades of existing in the shadows of others, someone had turned on a light and said, "She matters." "This is my stop," Brenda said, standing up. "See you later, Alina. And thanks for what you said." I watched her get off the bus and walk down the sidewalk with her worn-out bag and her shoes that needed replacing. One more invisible woman. One more life that went unnoticed in the vastness of the city. But I had seen her. I got off 3 stops later. My building stood in front of me. 5 floors of stained concrete, windows with rusty aluminum frames, a front door that never closed properly. Home. I walked up the stairs because the elevator had been broken for 2 months. My knees protested on every step. 3rd floor, door on the right. I took the keys from my bag and opened it. The apartment greeted me with its familiar smell. Dampness, old coffee, the cheap soap I used to wash dishes, 1 bedroom, a kitchen the size of a closet, a bathroom with cracked tiles, furniture I had bought second-hand or rescued from the street, a table where I ate alone every night, a bed where I slept alone every night. My entire life fit into 500 square ft. I collapsed onto the sagging sofa. The springs creaked under my weight. The fabric was so worn, I could see the stuffing coming out of the seams. I had thought about replacing it so many times, but I never had enough money. There was always something more urgent. The lights, the water, the food. Now I had $15 million. The reality of those words finally hit me. Not with joy, not with euphoria, with something heavier, with responsibility, with fear. What do you do with $15 million when you've lived 65 years with nothing? Buy a new apartment, expensive clothes, trips to places you've only seen in old magazines, and then what? Money doesn't bring back the lost years. It doesn't erase the loneliness. It doesn't bring back the son who forgot you or the husband who replaced you. Money is just money. I got up and walked to the window. From there I could see the buildings in her courtyard, clothes hanging on lines, pots with half-dead plants, a stray cat sleeping on a cardboard box. Simple life, real life. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my narrow bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling that I knew by heart. One near the lamp was shaped like a river. Another looked like a bird with its wings spread. I had studied them for years during sleepless nights, giving them names, making up stories, anything to avoid thinking about the emptiness that surrounded my life. But tonight, the cracks didn't distract me. My mind kept going back to that office, to Mr. Hayes's voice, reading Robert's words, to the letter where he confessed the truth I had kept silent for 30 years. I didn't lay the foundations. She did. I closed my eyes, feeling the tears slide toward my temples, warm and silent. They weren't tears of joy. They were tears of grief because part of me had died waiting for that recognition. And now that it had arrived, it was too late. Robert was dead. I couldn't look him in the eye and ask him why. Why did you forget me for 3 decades if you knew what I had done? Why did you wait until death to tell the truth? The clock read 3:00 in the morning when I finally got up. I put on a worn-out robe and went to the kitchen. I made tea on the old stove that had 1 broken burner. The water boiled with that sharp whistle I had heard thousands of times. I poured the tea into a chipped mug and sat at the table. The moonlight came through the window, drawing silver rectangles on the linoleum floor. I could hear the neighbors, someone snoring in the apartment above, a couple arguing in low voices 2 doors down, the cry of a baby that couldn't sleep, the sounds of poverty, of lives squeezed into spaces that were too small, of walls so thin that privacy was a luxury no one could afford. Would I keep living here with $15 million in the bank? The question sounded absurd, but it also sounded terrifying because this place, as miserable as it was mine. I knew it. I knew which step creaked the loudest, which faucet dripped at night, which neighbor knocked on your door when they needed salt or sugar. It was my world, small, worn out, but safe. Money would open doors, but it would also close others. I would no longer be the Aliner who sold pies on Sundays. I would no longer be the neighbor who lent out cups of flour. I would no longer be invisible. And invisibility, I had learned, was also a form of protection. I drank my tea slowly, letting the heat go down my throat. I thought about Rayan, about his devastated face when he heard the truth, about his held-back tears, about that terrible confession. I was ashamed of you. Those words had cut me like knives, but they had also freed me because I finally understood. For years, I had wondered what I had done wrong. Why had my son erased me from his life? What mistake had I made as a mother to deserve that oblivion? Now I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. The mistake hadn't been mine. It had been his. It had been a system that teaches people to value the material over the human, that rewards appearances and punishes authenticity, that turns humility into shame and wealth into virtue. Rayan had learned those lessons, and now he was paying the price. But could he change, really? Or was he just scared because his source of money had disappeared? 5 years. That's what Robert had given him. 5 years to show dignity, repentance, change of character, and the final decision would be mine. I would decide if he deserved part of that inheritance. The responsibility weighed on me like stones on my shoulders because I didn't want that power. I didn't want to be the judge of my son's soul. I didn't want to spend 5 years watching him, measuring every gesture, questioning every word, wondering if his change was genuine or just a desperate act. Robert had put me in that position, and maybe he had done it because he knew I was the only one who could do it with justice, not with vengeance, not with cruelty, but with that capacity that only mothers have, to see their children as they are, with all their flaws, and still leave the door open for redemption. The tea grew cold in my mug. The sky began to lighten slowly, turning from black to dark gray. Soon it would be dawn, and I would have to make decisions. Go back to Mr. Hayes's office. Sign papers. Make all of this official and real. But first, I needed something else. I got dressed in my usual clothes, old pants, a cotton blouse I had washed so many times. The original color was a mystery. My worn-out shoes. I grabbed my bag and left the apartment just as the first rays of sun touched the buildings. The streets were empty at that hour. Just a few early morning workers walking to bus stops, street sweepers cleaning the sidewalks, bakers opening their shops, filling the air with the smell of fresh bread. I walked without any real destination at first. I just needed to move to feel my feet on the pavement, to remember that I was still the same person I was yesterday. That money hadn't transformed me into something else overnight, but my feet took me without any conscious planning toward the city cemetery. I hadn't been here in years, not since my mother's funeral 15 years ago. The place was small, neglected, with crooked headstones and overgrown grass between the graves. The cemetery for the poor, for the forgotten, for those who didn't leave fortunes for marble mausoleums. I asked at the front office for the grave of Robert Griffin. The attendant, an old man in dirt-stained overalls, looked at me in surprise. The millionaire. He's not here, ma'am. They buried him at Oakwood Memorial Gardens, the private cemetery on the north side. Of course, even in death, Robert and I were separated by social class. I took another bus. This trip was longer, crossing from the poor neighborhoods to the residential areas where the houses had lawns and the cars didn't have rust. Oakwood Memorial Gardens was exactly what its name promised. Impeccable, with perfectly cut grass, ornamental trees, stone pathways, and gleaming granite headstones. I found Robert's grave in the newest section. The headstone was simple but elegant. His name, dates of birth and death, and one phrase, builder of dreams. I stood in front of it, my hands in my pockets, feeling the cold morning wind on my face. "Hello, Robert," I said softly. I didn't expect an answer. The dead don't talk, but I needed to say it. I needed to be here. I don't know if you can hear me. I don't know if there's anything after this, but if there is, I hope you're at peace. I hope you finally found what you were looking for your whole life. The wind rustled the leaves of the nearby trees. A bird sang in the distance. Life went on, indifferent to the conversations between the living and the dead. "I read your letter," I continued. "I heard your words, and I want you to know that I'm not angry. Not anymore. The anger left a long time ago. It left along with so many other things I had to let go of just to survive." I took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill my lungs. "You asked me why I never reminded you, why I never demanded what was mine. The truth is simple, because I loved you. And when you love someone, you don't keep score. You don't send invoices. You just give, even when it means losing everything." A tear rolled down my cheek. I didn't stop it. "But you also need to know something else. Something you didn't write in that letter because maybe you didn't know it. When I accepted that check for $5,000 and left, it wasn't just for dignity. It was because I saw something in your eyes that day. I saw relief. Relief that I wouldn't fight, that I wouldn't complicate your life, that I would disappear quietly and let you be happy with someone else." I wiped the tears with the back of my hand. And I thought, if my loving you means disappearing, then I'll disappear because that's how I loved, without conditions, without demands, without expecting anything. I knelt in front of Robert's grave, not caring that the damp earth was staining my old pants. My knees creaked with that familiar ache that was already part of my body, but I ignored it. I needed to be close. I needed that. If there was anything after death, he could hear what came next. "Your son," I said, my voice breaking. "Our son, Rayan. He's broken, Robert. I saw him yesterday. I saw him fall apart when he heard the truth. And I don't know what to do with that." The wind carried my words away, but I kept talking. You gave me 5 years to decide if he deserves part of the inheritance. 5 years to judge if his change is real. But how do you judge a son's heart? How do you measure repentance? How do you know if the tears are genuine or just fear of losing what was never his? I ran my fingers over the letters carved into the headstone. They were cold, hard, permanent. Part of me wants to punish him, wants him to feel even a fraction of the abandonment I felt for 30 years. To understand what it's like to be invisible, forgotten, erased. But another part just sees the boy he was, the baby I held, the son I loved before the world taught him to be ashamed of me. I sat back on my heels, feeling the dampness of the earth seep through the fabric. I don't know if I can forgive him, Robert. I don't know if I'll ever be able to look at him without remembering that smile when he told me I'd only get $10, without remembering years of unreturned calls, without remembering I wasn't invited to his wedding, that my grandchildren, if I have any, don't know my name. A sob escaped my throat, just one, dry and painful. But I can't hate him either because he's still my son, and that's something no will can change. No inheritance can erase. I stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from my knees with trembling hands. I'm going to accept your inheritance, not because I need it to be happy, not because money will fill the void you left, but because it's the only way to honor the truth, to acknowledge that, yes, I did build those foundations, and I deserve to be recognized. I looked at the headstone one last time, but the 5 years you gave Rayan, those aren't for me to judge him. They're for him to find himself, to decide what kind of man he wants to be. Not for money, not for an inheritance, but because he finally understood that there are things more valuable than bank accounts. I walked away from the grave, moving slowly down the stone path. The sun was higher in the sky now, lighting up the cemetery with that golden morning light. Everything looked clearer, more defined. The shadows were shorter, the colors more vivid. I took the bus back downtown. This time the ride felt shorter, or maybe I was calmer. There was something liberating about having spoken to Robert, even if it was just to a granite headstone. I had said aloud what I had kept in my chest for decades. I arrived at Mr. Hayes's office at 10:00 in the morning. The receptionist, a young woman with flawless makeup, looked me up and down before forcing a professional smile. "Do you have an appointment?" "I'm Alina Griffin. I was here yesterday for the will reading." Her expression changed instantly. The smile became wider, more genuine, or maybe just more fake. It was hard to tell. "Of course, Mrs. Griffin, Mr. Hayes is expecting you. Let me let him know you're here." She disappeared behind a door and returned seconds later. "You can go in." I walked down the same hallway as yesterday. The same cream-colored walls, the same abstract paintings, but everything felt different. Yesterday I had entered as an invisible woman. Today I entered as the eyes to fortune. Mr. Hayes stood up when I entered. He offered me his hand with a cordial smile. "Mrs. Griffin, I'm glad you returned. Were you able to get some rest?" "Not much," I admitted. "It's understandable. It's not every day one receives news like yesterday's." I sat in the same chair where I had been 24 hours earlier. Mr. Hayes opened his folder and took out several documents. "I have prepared all the necessary papers for the transfer. I also took the liberty of contacting a trusted financial advisor. With an inheritance of this magnitude, you will need professional guidance to manage investments, taxes, and wait," I interrupted. "Before I sign anything, I need to know something." Mr. Hayes looked at me attentively. "Robert's letter, the one you read yesterday. Can I have a copy?" "Of course. In fact, the original is yours." Mr. Griffin specified that it should be given to you after the reading. He took an envelope from the folder and handed it to me. It was thick ivoricled paper with my name written in Robert's shaky script. I took it with hands that trembled slightly. "Is there anything else I should know?" I asked. "Something that wasn't read yesterday." Mr. Hayes hesitated for a moment. Then he nodded. "There is one additional clause. Mr. Griffin left specific instructions on how the inheritance should be handled in the event you decided to reject it." "Reject it?" "Yes, he considered that possibility. He knew your character, Mrs. Griffin. He knew you might feel you didn't deserve the money, or that it was too much, or that it would bring complications to your life. That's why he left an additional letter, one that was only to be read if you rejected the inheritance." I felt a knot in my stomach. "What does that letter say?" Mr. Hayes took it from the folder. It was shorter than the other, written in the same shaky hand. "It says, if Alina rejects this inheritance, then everything must be donated to charitable institutions that support elderly women in vulnerable situations. Nothing is to go to my son. Nothing is to go to anyone who has not demonstrated the value of sacrifice. Because if a leaner will not accept what is hers by right, then no one else deserves to touch it. The words hit me like punches. He knew, I whispered. He knew I would consider rejecting it. He knew you well, ma'am. I was silent for a long moment, processing, understanding. Robert had put me at a crossroads. If I accepted the inheritance, I had to bear the responsibility of being a millionaire, of making decisions about Rayan, of changing my life forever. If I rejected it, I condemned my son to receive nothing, not even the chance to redeem himself in 5 years. It was one last lesson, one final teaching. He's forcing me to choose myself, I said aloud. Mr. Hayes looked at me curiously. All my life I chose others. Him, my son, anyone but me. And now from the grave he's telling me, this time you have to choose yourself. Because if you don't, if you reject what's yours, then everything is lost, even the possibility of Rayan changing. Mr. Hayes nodded slowly. He was a complex man, Mr. Griffin. He made many mistakes in life, but in death, he tried to create justice. I took the pen Mr. Hayes offered me. It was heavy, elegant, probably cost more than my food budget for a month. I held it over the first document. If I sign this, I said, my life changes forever. Yes, I won't be able to be invisible anymore. No, I'll have to learn to live with money, with responsibility, with the weight of decisions that affect others. That's correct. I took a deep breath. I thought of my small apartment, of my Sunday pies, of Brenda and her desperate search for work, of all the years of counting coins and stretching budgets and surviving day by day. I thought of Rayan, of the boy he was and the man he had become, of those 5 years he had to prove he could be better. And I thought of me, of a leaner, the woman who had given everything and asked for nothing. The woman who had been forgotten, erased, made invisible, the woman who deserved to be seen. I signed the first document, then the second, the third, the fourth. With each signature, I felt something change. Not outside, inside. I left Mr. Hayes's office with a manila envelope under my arm. Inside were copies of all the documents I had signed, certificates, bank transfers, authorizations, papers that turned words into legal, irrevocable reality. I was officially a millionaire. The word still sounded absurd in my mind, like a costume that didn't fit right, like shoes in the wrong size that made me walk differently. The sun was shining brightly now. The city was full of people moving in a hurry, chasing jobs, appointments, responsibilities. I stood on the sidewalk, feeling the weight of the envelope in my hands. Inside that envelope was my new life, but I didn't know how to start living it. Mrs. Griffin. I turned. It was a young woman, maybe 30, in a gray pants suit and carrying a professional briefcase, hair pulled back in a perfect bun, a smile that was friendly but calculated. I'm Emily Vance. Mr. Hayes contacted me. I'm a financial advisor. He asked me to make myself available to help you with the transition. Transition? What an elegant word for you. Have no idea how to handle $15 million. I didn't hire an advisor, I said cautiously. I know. It's a complimentary service from the firm, at least for the first few weeks. After that, you decide if you want to continue with my services or find someone else. She studied me with professional eyes, probably assessing my worn clothes, my old shoes, calculating how much work she'd have to do to turn this poor woman into a respectable millionaire. Look, Emily continued in a soft tone, as if talking to someone who doesn't understand complex things. I know this can be overwhelming. Going from a modest financial situation to having access to a considerable fortune is a dramatic change. A lot of people in your position make mistakes. They spend impulsively. They trust the wrong people. They lose everything in months. Her words should have offended me, but she was right. I knew nothing about investments or taxes or how to protect money. I barely knew how to stretch it to last until the end of the month. What do you propose? I asked. That we get a coffee. That we talk about your needs, your goals, your worries, and that we develop a financial plan that allows you to live comfortably without squandering what you received. I agreed because I needed help, even if it pained me to admit it. We walked 2 blocks to an elegant coffee shop, the kind of place where a cup of coffee costs the same as my daily food budget. Emily ordered a cappuccino with almond milk. I ordered a black coffee, the cheapest thing on the menu, out of pure instinct. You can order whatever you want, Emily said with a smile. You don't have to look at the prices anymore. Those words hit me like a bucket of cold water. She was right. I no longer had to count pennies. I no longer had to choose between coffee and food. I no longer had to look at prices, but I was still doing it because 30 years of poverty aren't erased with one signature. We sat at a table by the window. Emily took a tablet out of her briefcase and started asking questions. Questions no one had ever asked me. What are your current monthly expenses? I gave her the figures. Rent $800, utilities $150, food $30, and I scrimped. Transportation $60 total, less than $1,400 a month. My small pension barely covered it, and I always had to juggle. Emily typed on her tablet without expression, but I saw something in her eyes, compassion or maybe pity. Do you have any debts? No, I was never able to get a loan. Nobody lends to someone who has nothing to offer as collateral. Savings. I laughed humorlessly. $200 in a savings account that doesn't earn interest. Properties, investments, insurance. I shook my head at every question. Emily put the tablet on the table and looked at me directly. Mrs. Griffin. Alina, I'm going to be honest with you. Your situation is unique. You've gone from having practically nothing to having $15 million. That puts you in the top 1% wealthiest in the country. But it also makes you vulnerable. Vulnerable to what? To scammers. To relatives who will appear out of nowhere asking for money. To fraudulent investments. To people who will want to take advantage of your financial inexperience. And also vulnerable to yourself. To myself, yes. To the impulse to compensate for decades of deprivation by spending without control, or the opposite impulse, feeling like you don't deserve the money and continuing to live in poverty out of guilt. Both extremes are dangerous. I drank my coffee. It was bitter, strong, honest. Like this conversation. What do you suggest then? Emily leaned forward. First, absolute discretion. Don't tell anyone how much you inherited. The news will leak eventually, but the longer you maintain privacy, the better. Second, don't make any major decisions for the first 6 months. No buying houses, cars, giving large gifts. Let yourself adjust. Third, let's structure your money intelligently. She took out a piece of paper and started drawing circles. We'll divide your funds into 3 categories. 1, living money. We'll calculate a reasonable monthly amount that allows you to live comfortably without excess. Let's say $5,000 a month. That's $60,000 a year. More than you currently need, but it gives you room to improve your quality of life. $5,000 a month. More than 7 times what I used to spend. I felt dizzy just thinking about it. 2, emergency money. $1 million in an easily accessible account for any unforeseen event, illness, family emergencies, whatever. 3, long-term investments. The rest, approximately $14 million, will be invested conservatively in diversified funds that generate stable returns. What about taxes? I asked. That inheritance is subject to taxes. Approximately 30%, meaning of the $15 million, about $4.5 million will go to the government. You'll be left with $10.5 million net. The number was still astronomical to me. But even with $10 million, Emily continued, if you manage it well, you will never have to worry about money again. The annual returns from conservative investments could give you between $30 and $500,000 a year, more than you'll ever need to live on. My head was spinning. Numbers that made no sense. Amounts I couldn't visualize. I know it's a lot to process, Emily said gently. That's why I suggest we go step by step. Today, I just need you to open a new bank account. Tomorrow, we'll review investment options. Next week, we'll talk about insurance and asset protection. No rush, no pressure. I nodded because I couldn't find the words. We spent the next hour at the bank, a different bank than the one I had used all my life. This one had marble floors, executives in expensive suits, and a VIP area where they served us gourmet coffee and imported cookies. The manager, a middle-aged man with a silk tie, treated me like I was someone important. He smiled too much. He spoke in a soft, almost reverent tone. He called me Mrs. Griffin every other sentence. I signed more papers, opened accounts, received bank cards that shined like precious metals, cards with credit limits I could never possibly use. When we left the bank, it was late afternoon. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in orange and pink. Where do you live currently? Emily asked as we walked toward the bus stop. I gave her the address. I saw her expression change subtly. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. I knew that neighborhood. I knew what kind of buildings were there, what kind of lives. You'll want to move eventually, she said tactfully. It doesn't have to be right away, but when you're ready, I can help you find a safer, more comfortable place. I don't want a mansion, I said firmly. It doesn't have